Hi everyone, welcome to the second lecture video for English 484W. So in this video, I'm going to be looking more closely at cat person. So just some details of the story that stood out to me. So I'm just going to get into a PowerPoint here. Okay, so yeah, in this lecture, I'm just going to be reading Cat Person by Kristen Roupenian a little bit more closely than I did perhaps in the previous video. So in this lecture, I'm going to be looking at the cover photograph of Cat Person, so the two people kissing. It's kind of an image that I've used across all the different platforms of this course. And perhaps that's not a great choice because it is a little bit, I know a lot of people describe the image as being a little bit gross or icky. It does for some reason. I'm curious to really hear other people's interpretations of the photo, but it does seem like a bad kiss to a lot of people, and to me. So I'll be curious to hear what you guys thought of the photo. I'm just going to be looking at some of the formal features of Cat Person, so the language, how Roupenian sets up characterization, and then I'm going to be getting into the themes of Cat Person, particularly how they relate to the Me Too movement. And then finally, I'm just going to touch, why not, I'm going to end the video by talking about the ending of Cat Person. Not so much talking about, I have my own kind of thoughts on the ending of Cat Person, but I'm mostly just going to be asking questions to you guys, what you guys thought about the ending of the text. Okay, so here is the photographer that took the photo specifically designed for the story. So she was requested by the New Yorker, who published Cat Person, to take a photo that captured maybe some of the themes of the story. And here's just a quote from Carucci. She writes, or she says, "The blackness between his lips was about the conceptual space between a couple, any couple. Even if you've been married for 20 years, there's something that's always there between two people. With the composition, I wanted to create that space." So again, particularly it's a very gendered photograph. So the woman is kind of depicted as passive a little bit. Her lips aren't as open as the man's lips. The man is very kind of, his beard is very prominent, kind of like a little bit like Cat Person. His skin is a little bit darker. So it is a kind of very gendered photograph. And that blackness between his lips, that gap between kind of male or men and women is again kind of reflected in this photograph, and I think in an interesting way. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of background to the photo, but also kind of curious what you guys think of this photo. Okay, so just moving along. Here are some of the kind of the linguistic details of the story that I thought were a little bit interesting to me. So I'm not a huge fan of word clouds, but I did make this word cloud. I made it with a website. If you don't know it, it's called Voyant Tools. I can send around the link if you guys are more curious about that website, but it performs a basic kind of I guess a kind of a computer analysis of a text. And here this word cloud is showing the most prominent words in this text. And obviously some of them are more interesting than others. I thought a lot of the verbs that Margot kind of uses when she's talking or she's interpreting Robert, there's some of them that are present here. So she imagined, she thought, she felt. I noticed quite a bit of "she wondered" in the text, but I don't see it here. But there are kind of a lot of verbs that she uses that are kind of interpretive. So a lot of the text, a lot of the language is this constant interpretation of Robert. And it even gets very kind of meta. So she's interpreting his interpretation of her. And he's also kind of constantly interpreting her interpretation of him as well. There's some other kind of interesting words here. So movie. Movies are kind of a major motif of the story. That it doesn't really stand out initially, but I mean, they meet in a movie theater. Their first date is at a movie, and when they go back to Robert's place, they also, after they have sex, they also watch a movie. Although none of these movie watching experiences are very good. They never really describe the movies that much, or liking them or anything like that. It is a little bit interesting. I This is just kind of a suspicion of mine, but the movie that they go to on the date, it's described as this depressing Holocaust film, and the exact time period of when the story is set is a little bit ambiguous. It could be happening at any time, really, except for the detail of the emojis. So this story is taking place in the time of texting emojis, whatever that time period really means. But there was a Harvey Weinstein film about the Holocaust that was kind of made, I think, around 2011 or 2012. That was kind of a depressing, kind of artsy Holocaust film. So I'm not sure if Roupenian is kind of referencing that at all, kind of more directly connecting her story to Me Too, or if that's just me perhaps overreading into it. But I thought it was just kind of an interesting, perhaps, potential reference. The other kind of word that stands out here is just, or even like. So just and like are these words that perhaps not all of us, but I use sometimes when I'm talking, when I'm in perhaps an awkward social situation or a new social situation, or there's some social tension. Even something as simple as when you go to a cafe, I'm in the habit of saying, I just like a coffee, please. So that just what is it really doing in the sentence? I just like a coffee. Or yeah, what is it doing? It's kind of softening the demand that kind of everyday speech puts on people. It's kind of softening the social interaction. But in cat person especially, I think, I haven't really looked at it very closely, but I'd be interested to see if just is kind of working in a similar way to that. So Margot using it to soften her her approach to Robert, or to soften the things that she says to him a little bit. It's just kind of an interesting kind of modifier for when we're talking, that it's not really clear what it's doing, at least at a grammatical level, but it's doing something at a social level that I think is perhaps interesting to think about. Okay, just some other kind of things that stood out. So Robert frequently uses a very kind of imperative language when he's talking to Margot. So I've just put some examples down there. And that imperative language, that I think that is kind of like one of the aspects of toxic masculinity in the text. That idea that you would feel comfortable giving orders to, not so much orders. I mean, some of them are not very serious, like give me your phone number. Although, I mean, it is a little bit ambiguous if it is an order or if it's just kind of casual conversation. But he uses imperatives enough that it is kind of a pattern, I think. So give me your phone number, study hard, sweetheart, and then take that thing off. So he does feel kind of very comfortable, at least at the level of his speech, in playing the bossy role, or the commanding role, or again, kind of a masculine. Perhaps at least one interpretation of masculinity. Okay, and then finally, this the final little box here. So Robert is frequently kind of connected to animals. He's wearing a rabbit fur hat. One of the more famous quotes from the story, Margot felt as if she were petting a large, skittish animal like a horse or a bear, skillfully coaxing it to eat from her hand. And there's this other couple animal-like references there. So that kind of imagery adds to the story is you take that little gap that is in that photograph between the man and the woman, and I think this animal-like language makes that gap expand so that it's not just at one point Margot wonders if, or she has a sentence where she's wondering, I wonder if Robert is a normal person like myself. Uh, there's this like very strong disconnection between these two characters that at certain points is kind of close. There's a little bit of a gap between them that they're trying to get across, but sometimes it just completely widens massively to where they're so different that it's like a human communicating with an animal or something like that. And obviously, I mean, some of you may have cats or dogs or whatever kind of pets that you think you can kind of communicate with, or you have some kind of communicational rapport, but you can't have a conversation with an animal. So by comparing Robert to an animal, it makes that communicational gap so wide that it's kind of frightening that there's such a massive chasm between these two people. So that's what I think the animal language is adding to the story. Okay, so this is very kind of I guess kind of very, there's a field of literary criticism called digital humanities. So it's kind of looking at quantifying or numerical representations of text. So I'm doing a very kind of light version of that. This just came out of an expression from an article about Cat Person that I read. Did Cat Person deserve the hype? It was published in the Niche, and a writer there had the expression literary bullet time to describe the sex scene between Robert and Margot. So bullet time is from The Matrix, so I have a little GIF here of this kind of slow motion encounter, which I think is kind of a little bit humorous to think about in relationship to the sex scene that it does. Kind of Margot is in this kind of position of dodging successfully or unsuccessfully these bullets from Robert, and everything's just going so slowly, and you can see perhaps too much of this sex scene is kind of very drawn out. So on the left-hand side, I just have a kind of a display of how Roupenian kind of structures time in the story. The story starts off very kind of quickly. So it very kind of quickly, we read every page at the very start of the story represents 10 days. So we advance very quickly into this relationship. A lot of time passes in the first few pages of the story. And then when we get to the date, time starts to move a little bit more slowly. So one page starts to be about 1 hour in their interaction. And then when we get to the sex scene, it starts to move very, very slowly. So if at the very start of the story, 1 page equals 10 days, by the sex scene, we're at 1 page equals 6 minutes on average. So there's a very kind of compression of time into this kind of sexual encounter. And then once we get to the denouement of the story, then we're kind of back to similarly during the courtship where time is moving much more fast. So yeah, I think it is kind of an interesting way to structure a text. It does make the sex scene a lot more kind of uncomfortable, I think, or awkward, because we do get perhaps too many details. It kind of forces us to be there with Robert and Margot in this kind of very horrible, awkward physical encounter. So yeah, I think this kind of structure of the story is purposeful on Roupenian's part, and again, it's doing something in the story. Okay, so characterization. So specifically looking at Robert. So I have this blot, this ink blot that they use I think in psychoanalysis to have people kind of tell what they see in the image. So it's kind of something that's really open to interpretation. Usually when we look at one of these kind of blots, we kind of project something onto it. So we see something in these blots that is kind of deep within us, perhaps. We kind of use these blots to kind of project our own, perhaps our fantasies onto, or something in our unconscious. So I just have this Roupenian quote. She writes, "When I started writing the story, I had the idea of a person who had adopted all these familiar signifiers as a kind of camouflage, but with something else or nothing at all underneath." So the familiar signifiers there, I'm interpreting that as kind of the gender signifiers. So Robert has all these kind of details surrounding him that kind of make him seem like a normal person. So he has the lumberjack aura, he has tattoos, he dresses in kind of a normal fashion, I would say. When she goes to his apartment in his living room, there's all these kind of signifiers of normality. So board games, art, movies, records, these kind of signifiers that make you feel like this is a normal person like you. But at the same time, all they are is just kind of objects. And we don't really, beyond these kind of objects, we don't really get any kind of feeling for Robert, really. And that's particularly how the story is structured. It's kind of third person narration, but the third person narrator really kind of just only relates Margot's experience of, or interpretations of Robert. Robert's voice is completely silenced from the text. Even in the final kind of closing text, you can kind of think that as kind of where Robert's personality emerges, but it's just coming through a phone, and Margot and her friend are just reading these texts. So it's not exactly any kind of insight into his character at all. We never really get any insight into his character, except perhaps with the final text where I'm curious what you guys think. If that final text, the final word text, is kind of evidence for what kind of character he really is underneath it all. If we get kind of an insight into his character at that point, or if you think that we still don't get any insight into this character, whether this kind of the final text is still open to interpretation, or if it's just the end of interpretation. Yeah, and then, yeah. At one point, when Margot and him are first going on the date, she says she hardly knew anything about him at all, which is a kind of a weird thing to say about someone that you've been communicating with for 2 months, and that her parents were already asking about. Okay, so just one more kind of note on characterization, or this is perhaps not characterization, but just dialogue. So Robert is very kind of fond of using these emojis to communicate with Margot. And again, these emojis are, at one point, they kind of do signify, so they are intended to signify love, but at the same time, they're also camouflage. So when you send an emoji, it's a very easy, especially like a heart emoji, it's a very easy thing to do. It's kind of like typing lol to someone's joke. You can type lol, but it doesn't mean that you're actually laughing out loud. So when you send in a heart emoji, it's supposed to signify love, that you love this person or you're fond of them, but it also can completely act as what Roupenian calls camouflage. So there's no real face there for a person to interpret. I read an article recently that was talking about how Zoom, which we'll be doing on Wednesday, why it's so tiring for people. And that's because when we're interacting with people face to face, not so much face on a screen, but face to face in kind of a bodily IRL encounter, we do a lot of kind of unconscious interpretation of another person's just very kind of basic, their facial, the way that their face kind of moves. We're always kind of interpreting that unconsciously and adjusting ourselves to that as well. I think in the article it mentioned that the only way that we can actually experience sympathy or empathy with another person's emotions in person is by kind of mimicking their expressions and unconsciously. So if a person looks sad, then you kind of make your own face look sad. Obviously, you're not grinning at them while they're looking sad. You kind of are constantly adjusting your face to their face. So these emojis, at one point, at a certain point, they do communicate, but they also, at another point, they act as kind of a blockage to communication as well. And I just have a quote here from Clint Burnham, who's actually an SFU professor in the English department, and not to do TMI, but he's also my supervisor. So he wrote an article about the Tony Clement scandal. Tony Clement was a parliamentary figure in Canada who was kind of had his own Me Too moment where he was outed as just engaging in texting that was overly sexual. A lot of women commented on or came out to say that his liking of their posts on Instagram was often aggressive, which is kind of a interesting way to talk about liking something. What is aggressive liking? They're, I guess, liking too much, but there are all these kind of social rules or implicit kind of behaviors that are expected, even on social media, for how you should like. Even though a like is such a simple, it's just a click, but there are still rules like that you should wait 5 or 10 minutes before you like this person's photo, so it doesn't seem like you're just like waiting for them to post. And Burnham writes that there's a fundamental ambiguity in communication that has been exacerbated with online and social media. So that ambiguity of why did this person like my post, or why did this person like my post so quickly? Why is this person liking all my posts? There's a certain ambiguity to the like or to the emoji where it seems very simple, like a like just means that you like something, but people can like things for different reasons. And you kind of have to interpret what those reasons might be. And there's kind of a limit to that interpretation as well, that you'll never really know why they're liking or why they're not liking your posts. Okay, and then this is the final kind of formal feature. Sorry, these images are a little bit disturbing, but this is just another kind of, I talked about the Harvey Weinstein reference, perhaps. This is another kind of potential reference in the text. So Robert's cats are called Moo and Yan. There's a horror manga artist who wrote this manga about these two cats called Yan and Moo. And yeah, this reference, if it is a correct reference, I'm not totally sure. It does seem a little bit coincidental, but this reference does kind of add to the horror aspects of the story. I think that Robert, if his cats are really based on these two cats from a horror manga, it does make him a bit of a more eerie, perhaps scary character. And I think a lot of the story, its interpretation comes down to if you think Robert actually has cats or he doesn't. So I'll just move on from this. Okay, so we're getting to the end here. I just wanted to talk about some of the themes of the story that connect to Me Too. So one of those kind of the primary ones is Margot's constant feeling of fear in this encounter. So I just have some quotes from the text. There's quite a few of them actually where she expresses a feeling of terror or fear or just being frightened. And she also kind of questions that fear constantly as well. So I'll just read the first quote. So Margot became wildly uncomfortable. It occurred to her that he could take her someplace and rape and murder her. She wondered if the discomfort in the car was her fault, because she was acting jumpy and nervous, like the kind of girl who thought she was going to get murdered every time she went on a date. So Margot experiences this fear, but is also constantly questioning that fear. Um, and that is a lot of the Me Too narratives or theories that were coming out at the time, or just kind of basic feminist theory going back quite a long way. I had this Susan Brown Miller, who's a feminist theorist, uh, in a book that she wrote in, I think it was 1975, about rape culture called Against Our Will, where she writes that rape is nothing more or less than a conscious process of intimidation by which all men keep all women in a state of fear. So this is where those Me Too arguments or pushbacks that I think the hashtag was not all men. So not all men are rapists, but at the same time, there's the argument that all men benefit to a certain degree from the atmosphere of fear that they create for women in today's society. Um, and what I mean by that is what's reflected in Cat Person itself. So Robert uh, engages in a sexual encounter with a woman who doesn't really want to be there, but she at the same time she feels scared to extricate herself from or remove herself from the situation. So to a certain degree, Robert benefits from her fear, and he benefits to the degree of he experiences sexual pleasure from this encounter, whereas Margot experiences no pleasure. She experiences a great amount of distress. So that is one of those things where perhaps we could say that Robert is not a rapist. I think it's open for interpretation, but he's still benefiting in the story from the state of fear that Margot is in, that he could rape and murder her, because there is uh, an alarming amount of sexual violence that is still being directed at women today. So all men kind of do benefit in it is kind of a cynical and kind of depressing thing to say, but yeah, all men kind of do benefit from patriarchy and violent systems of patriarchy. And then I just have this quote on the right hand side from Eleanor Halls. Uh, so it is depressing to realize how fearful women are of being alone with a man. Men will never live with that fear in the presence of women. They will never feel physically overpowered in the same way. It is impossible for them to fully empathize. So again, we're getting back to that kind of gap between male and female experience of the world that, again, there's kind of a very pessimistic thought expressed here from Halls that it is impossible for them to fully empathize. So men can be as feminist as they want to be. They can try to understand where women are coming from. They can try to completely connect to women's experience, but they'll never really get it. So there is kind of a communicative gap that Halls is pointing out, kind of spreads itself across this whole course. Okay, so one more kind of slide, but this one, so these are some themes of the story that I think, so the last slide was connecting to Me Too. This one is complicating Me Too slightly. So the story kind of, a little bit like the Aziz story, it complicates some of the kind of the gender or power or agency narratives that were going on at the time. So Robert isn't in a very kind of obvious position of power over Margot. The actual position of the two in terms of power and agency is constantly shifting. And even in terms of gender, it shifts a little bit. So this is a man and a woman, but their behaviors are, and all of our behaviors a little bit, kind of stray across gender lines constantly. Gender is a social construct, so it isn't something that's, or gender is experienced as a social construct, so it isn't something that's innate to us, but it is kind of it's given to us by society, what kind of gender roles that we feel comfortable positioning ourselves in. So Robert, here's some quotes from Robert. Robert, he showed it only by stepping back, as though to make her lean toward him to try a little harder. This is from their initial kind of flirting encounter, and Robert is kind of playing a little bit hard to get. So we're not so much challenging gender stereotypes here, but he's not kind of pursuing her in the kind of the typical way that we expect from the masculine subject. And then when they're having sex, Robert made that sound again, that high-pitched feminine whine. So there's some feminine aspects to his character as well. Margot, by the end of the encounter, when they're having the sexual encounter, she is completely positioned without agency. She doesn't feel like she can escape this encounter. She feels completely trapped. She says she feels the words are a pinned stasis. So she is kind of, in that encounter, she is kind of positioned as powerless. But before that, there are kind of ambiguities to her being just the victim. She is in control, or she does exhibit agency in some parts of the story. So she says at one point that the dynamic had shifted out of her favor. So at one point the dynamic was in her favor. And then at another point, kind of more insidiously, she writes, she says, once she knew how to hurt him, she also knew how he could be soothed. So she is in a position of power that she can hurt him. And I just have another kind of quote from Halls on the right-hand side here, that Cat Person has shocked men who only know one narrative, that men have agency and women don't. Margot has the power. For men who have held on to warped idealism that women should be meek, polite, and loving, Margot's interior monologue, in which she shows herself to be as crude, shallow, and judgmental as any man, is a reality check. So this is kind of, I think Halls is kind of pointing to why men had such a negative reaction to this story. It's not so much that Robert is criticized, but that Margot is kind of elevated to being in any kind of position of power over Robert, not minding gender so much. So yeah, and Halls is another kind of good point that kind of speaks to the whole story as well, that toxic masculinity hurts men too. So toxic masculinity in this story, it hurts Margot in that she has this horrible encounter. But Robert is a very kind of sad figure as well. So he's a person that he takes part in all the kind of the performances of masculinity. So the tattoos, the lumberjack aura, the imperative language. He's using all these kind of signifiers of masculinity to make himself seem more masculine. But at the end of the day, he doesn't really completely live up to this ideal of masculinity. He's always kind of failing at it to different degrees, or he's very vulnerable, and the story describes him as having these hunched over shoulders and kind of protecting himself. So there is this kind of vulnerability to him, this easiness to be hurt, as Margot kind of indicates, that he's not this kind of he has been damaged in some way, and perhaps gender or his social conditioning, either by movies or by his kind of obvious pornography use, he has been damaged in some way by the way that society kind of structures gender, that he has all these kind of expectations of what it means to be a man that he can't really live up to, and that leaves him kind of open to be hurt, as Margot says. Okay, so yeah, so just the ending. I've done a kind of perhaps overextensive interpretation of the story. So at this point, I'm just kind of curious what you guys think of the ending of the story. So I just have a couple of questions here. The first question: did you read Cat Person backwards or forwards, or a mix of both? Backwards, meaning that Robert's final text was a revelation that made you go backward through the text, looking for clues that hinted this was coming. And forwards, meaning that you could tell this kind of thing was coming the whole time. And then the second question, alternatively, did you feel the final text cheapened the story at all? It has a gut punch effect, at least for me. In each of the times that I've read the story, it still kind of hit me pretty hard, that the final kind of texting conversation. And I'm not sure why. So it has a gut punch effect. It has a really kind of strong effect on the reader. That was probably one of the reasons that the story went viral. But perhaps a criticism is it also dissolves the ambiguity to Robert's character that the story kind of runs on as its fuel, like kind of figuring out, is Robert a normal person? Is he a good person? Is he a bad person? The final text kind of reveals that he's a bad person. Although you can kind of do a sympathetic interpretation that maybe he was drunk, maybe he just, I don't know. I think there, at least from my perspective, there is a very strong limit to that sympathy. Once you send that final text, no matter how drunk or how hurt you are, you're kind of outing yourself as a bad person, at least to me. But I'd be interested to see what you guys think. And then just one final question. Would the story have been more effective, or how would the story have been different, perhaps, without the final one-word text? Okay, so those are the kind of questions that I'll just post in the Discord, and hopefully you guys can respond there to them, or if you have any other kind of questions or comments about the story, also feel free to post those in the Discord. So yeah, that's the end of this presentation. I do just have one more image of something that happened to me 2 days ago when I was reading this story. I had this encounter. Me and my partner were just picking up some takeout food, and we were parked on Commercial Drive, and a car parks in front of us, and here's that car. So in the story, Robert is described as driving a muddy white Civic. And guess what parks in front of me? A very muddy white Civic. And of course, a man with a beard gets out of the car. So that terrified me. But I think it's also good that these are stories, but at the same time, there's a real life connection, sometimes more obvious than at other times, that there are Roberts out there. There are a lot of Roberts out there. I'm not judging by car, but just the idea that these characters in the story do represent real life people, and those real life people are all around us. Perhaps less so right now that we're in quarantine, but it does kind of remind us that even though we're reading fictional stories, they do kind of point to real life encounters. So I'll just close with that. And I'll see you guys in the Discord. Bye for now.